Thanks very much, Nick, for this introduction. I'm honored to be here, particularly if I could get this thing to work. Yep. Also, of course, because now the lecture is the first Fred Jevons Lecture. I'm also very happy that I see so many colleagues and friends in the audience, so it feels also like a reunion. Having said that, you have to do now with my thoughts about fashions in science policy, past and present. And that's been a sort of observation from my side that this happens. And the invitation to this lecture was an occasion to draw out some of these thoughts. So that's what you will be hearing from me. I need to make a prefatory remark. This book, Science Observed, you can see it's old and it's been read because it was an important input into the work that I was doing in Leiden at the time, setting up chemistry and society, but also science, technology and society courses and research program. It was an introduction. At the time, he must have said, because I saw it quoted somewhere, that his students had nothing to read about this complex topic, so he wrote the book for them. And then there was a review in that year by John Maddox, always good for some critical remarks. And he had quite a positive review, but then he queried, where does Jevons actually stand? Especially on this issue, what was important for John Maddox at the time, good science, bad science. Well, my lecture, you could say, is about science policy observed, and I don't take a strong stand either. Or at least, as I say here, I want to do analysis and diagnosis before I take a stand. So that's what you'll be hearing from me. And I hope that will sort of stimulate you to do some analysis and diagnosis and perhaps take a stand as well. So it will become like an invitation to a debate just as much as it is a paper in its own right. So my topic in general terms is fashions. Not all the meanings of the notion of fashions, but a particular cross-section. And I'll introduce that a little bit for a number of reasons, as you will see, before I get into a number what I consider to be cases of fashions in science policy, broadly speaking. It's not necessarily a good sample of everything that could fall under this term. It's an exploration, and I hope you will join me on this journey of exploration and then see what we get out of that. One thing, it's the pejorative meaning of the term, is a passing fad. And people who've heard my title were already talking about fashions and fads and fallacies, and so they were thinking in those terms. And I have a more constructive view of fashions. I'm into constructive, as you heard Mick say. It's also something that sweeps actors with them. So it's in that sense like a bandwagon. And then for the time being, it actually shapes their thinking and their action. And that's one reason why fashions will have some effects. I'll come back to that point a number of times. What also happens is that it is like exploiting an opportunity. So you could call it a gold rush. And like gold, which is found somewhere, it can get exhausted or more costly to actually get out of the water or the earth. And so there is already in these examples something which shows that it's somewhat temporary, and also there might be even some quantitative aspects, which I will not develop at length, but it will be visible in my next few slides. One example of such a gold rush thing is like high temperature superconductive materials. And there have been curves of activities and publications of this new discovery, unexpected discovery, and because the threshold to enter that area was very low in terms of scientific infrastructure, it could grow very fast, and then there was some shakeout that only a number of groups remain. Polywater is a small version of that same story, and there it happened that because of the interest in the phenomenon and the work on it, people discovered that it actually didn't exist. So that story had an unhappy ending, perhaps for the polywater protagonists. Overall promise of nanotechnology might have similar dynamics. I've been working on nanotechnology for the last 10 years or so I could tell you more about that if you're interested. Or even a very recondite example, the theory of determinants in the mathematics during the 19th century. And I'll use that to show you a picture where you see, that's actually my drawing, that's why the text is in Dutch. It came from my attempt at Science Observed in the mid-70s. I actually used this article by May to look at his differentiation between different kinds of publications, and you see under A, that is the substantial stuff at the bottom. Then you get the textbooks and so on, and then you get this peak of, well, trivial and repetitive publication, that's what May said, but just, I mean, filling up the pages of the journals, but at the same time trying out all sorts and bits and pieces of the theory of determinants. So I'm not as negative or pejorative as he was at the time. And this is something which actually is not just a thing that historians of science do. People working in a growing field can have the same idea. So when we were working on membrane science and technology, one of the PhD students who was quite active said, you know, it's all about the G-wish factor. And he drew a curve like that. And you see, maybe there is a pointer somewhere. Yeah. So you see that this same thing about substantial work and a sort of peak of the G-wish situation is there. And that actually reminds people who have been working on innovation and public acceptance very much of the so-called Gartner hype curve, or technological hype curve, or sometimes hype and disappointment curve, where you see the technology trigger, where it starts, the peak of inflated expectations, disillusionment, and then you get the sort of substantial remainders, like a shakeout in a new sector where firms enter, particularly if the thresholds are low, and then there are too many competitors and there is this shakeout. Such curves of various kinds, in various sectors and about various topics, makes you wonder whether actually this is a necessary thing. Is it possible to have a world without hype possible, where you could go straight from the first option to the actual substantial results, what Gartner called plateau of productivity? Well, you could ask the same question, if you can read it. Is a world possible, a science policy world possible, without fashions? And that's part of my general background question. And to my mind, the answer is no. Just like there will be hype, there will also be fashions in science policy. This is a conclusion, you could say, but not a conclusion that I arrive after extensive empirical work, but it's the sort of conclusion that you get when articulating what you're observing. One thing which just reminds you of, perhaps, but definitely reminded me of, is the so-called issue attention cycle, which was published by Downes in 1972 as a sort of essay. And it's often reduced to what you could call newsworthiness. What is an opportunity for media to actually exploit it in articles, comments, whatever. And it's an opportunity that becomes exhausted. The media loses interest, the public loses interest, and there is a move to another topic. So you get these kinds of tracing of issue attention cycle. Here it's about the gun shootings in the United States, and you see a pattern of increased media interest, and then it goes down. And something remains of that in terms of referring back to the events, but it's also a sort of almost passing fad, you could say. But then if you look to what Downes actually did, he had another story to tell about how problems are recognized and how these are addressed to some extent. And then after some time, they are forgotten or they're left in a limbo where they sometimes are being picked up from again. And he actually uses a number of phases, 5 stages here. And you can see this is not what he drew, this is what somebody else drew who was teaching this stuff. That it is like a curve, only it's not quite clear what's on the vertical axis. My natural science background comes back here. I want to know what the axes mean. Anyway, if you look at his actual descriptions, you can see why it is broader and also why it's interesting for me when talking about fashions in science policy. There might be this pre-problem stage where the things are latent, they're unnoticed, maybe they're not there at all yet. Then you see what he calls alarmed discovery. Hey, what's happening? And euphoric enthusiasm about solving the problem, often with the help of science and technology. That's how he discussed his main topic and his examples from environmental issues. But then when you start working on it, you realize that progress, and particularly significant progress, is not easy. And you might give up, and you might put your efforts elsewhere. So then you get this, what he calls gradual decline of intense public interest. That's the only thing which is picked up in the sort of trivial versions of the issue attention cycle. And then you get the post-problem stage, what he calls a prolonged limbo. So it doesn't disappear, but it's not used anymore. What he doesn't discuss at any length is the thing which I left open here and which is actually particularly important. It's the articulation of this issue, whether it's an environmental issue or a science policy issue. There are negotiations about what it means, what you should do. There is investment in action. And then you get this now, what is now called the third phase, of realizing how difficult it might be. And these articulations, negotiations, investments actually leave residues, remainders, programs, institutions, networks, which persist even after the fashion has passed by. And that's what he actually says himself. And there are more examples. If you're into implementation of science and technology priorities, you can see that the things that are happen under that particular priority actually create what I've called at one moment an implementation infrastructure, which makes it easier for subsequent priorities to get implemented. That's a similar sort of residue, which is important actually to understand what the whole landscape of science and science policy is. Now, for fashions in science policy, there you have to think a bit about what is the opportunity that is explored and gives rise to fashions. One such an opportunity, which is not the one that I will talking about, is priorities and the convergence of these priorities. You can say every country wants to do nanotechnology, by now synthetic biology, and so on. There are funding races for nanotechnology where countries compete in terms of how much they fund the new field. And that's to some extent driven by what's called no-regret decision-making. If I go for what everybody does, then if it goes wrong, it ends badly, then I can't be blamed because everybody did it. If I go out on a limb and do my own thing and it goes wrong, then I will be blamed. So I said that's not my topic, although the mechanisms which lead to mimesis are important with the fashions as well, of course. What I think is a good point to start is that science policy practitioners, and sometimes analysts, they need ideas, they need approaches which will inspire, which will mobilize others, and which then, these ideas, offer them an opportunity to act wisely, you could say, if it's a good idea, and at least be seen to act wisely. And so this is where fashions are born. And these can be provided, these ideas, by analysts. That's typically for the mode 2 of knowledge production, but it happens in other cases as well. Or they can occur in practice and then be given a name, like open innovation with Chesbro, yeah, whatever his name. You know it, look, Chesbro. Yeah. So my cases, and as I said, they're not a sort of well-constructed sample that allows me to generalize. It happens that these examples have inspired me to think about these phenomena. As you can read, the term is attributed to Alvin Weinberg, but in his own article, he says that he probably got it from Fred Hoyle, the British astronomer. Alvin Weinberg, at the time, I should indicate that, for me he's a sort of well-known figure. He was into energy physics and nuclear energy also, and he was at that time also a member of the President's Science Advisory Council in the United States, and together with others thinking about the whole situation, and as I'll come back to that briefly later, that situation at the time was in a number of ways a response to what's been called the Sputnik shock, where the United States felt very comfortable in its scientific and technological progress, but also it's being way ahead of Soviet Union. This is time of sort of, well, the Cold War already. And so then it was a big shock that actually the Soviet Union was the first to send a satellite into space, the Sputnik. And that led to soul searching, to more investment in university research in the United States, the setup of these President's Science Advisory Council. And part of that was that people like Alvin Weinberg started to think about how to manage, you could say, in the broad sense of the word, manage science in society. Derek de Solla Price, who wrote up his very nice little book in about the same period, that little book was at the time sort of night table reading for science policy practitioners. My then professor in chemistry, physical chemistry, was also very active in trying to set up science policy in the Netherlands and in Europe. And he told me that he had been reading and rereading it, but that quite a number of his colleagues were reading it as well. So you could say that some of the features of a fashion were becoming visible at that time. But it was not just a fashion, it was also this reflection based on analysis and diagnosis. And one of my points in this sort of exploration of the topic is that actually why it can become a source of a fashion is because there's both a transformation of science that's being captured by the observation, and there is a decision-making problem which makes it for real. And big science had both. Then a note, smaller letters, but you can still read it from the back perhaps. Later on, when big science was part of the repertoire already, there was a task force of US Congress who did quite substantial research with the help of the Library of Congress. And they had the definition, both in terms of money invested, like $25 million, And organization must be big, must be lots of teamwork, this division of labor. And they were surprised that lots of big science occurred before what they thought of as the era of big science, which for them started after the Second World War. And so their original notion of big science might be historically incorrect, also for Alvin Weinberg. But still, it could become powerful, and was actually quite powerful. And a further interesting footnote is that actually the concern about big science had been there already in relation to the efforts of German science to be big in electrical engineering, in synthetic dyestuffs, in organization of big laboratories. It was called Großbetrieb, and that was not a good thing for science. And actually, part of the reasons why the Nobel Prize was created and became popular was that it was for individuals. So it restored this notion that science, real science, is done by creative individuals. So, some history in order to support my point that fashions need not necessarily be historically correct in how they diagnose the situation. Important features of this case: there's a keyword or a key phrase in this here, big science, which somehow captures this diagnosis. And that implies that it's very easy for this diagnosis to travel. You don't have to spend hours explaining about changes in science. You just said big science is coming and we should do something about it. And it can just be used in many places, and this is part of the mechanism of fashions. Also, this keyword, key phrase, is open-ended. It can be used for different purposes by different actors, whether it's about the organization or the amount of money or the eventual outcomes, which you will emphasize or not. And as I said, it may not be historically correct, but it will still be forceful. And what I also intimated is that the driver for this fashion was this overall reflection on what was happening with science and technology in the United States. This became a focus, this big science thing, and now it's part of the repertoire. You can refer to it and everybody knows it. Even it's not such a big challenge anymore as it was thought to be then. Second case, mode 2 of knowledge production. We have one of the authorities on it here in the room, if I may say so. And I'll not go at great length, you will see why. The booklet, 94, from Mike Gibbons and his colleagues, that did create a stir. It was not the same effect as the Little Science, Big Science of Director Solar Price, but it had there were some similarities. It came at the right time, you could say, and made an interesting diagnosis, and a strong diagnosis, and that's why it created a stir. Also, because people would not always understand the argument made in it. I'm using here some data from an article of Lawrence Hessels and Harro van Lente in the research policy. They looked at citations, period of 10 years. They were still increasing in that period, but perhaps slowing down a bit. They also looked at the articles, and about 80% used this reference to mode 2 as just a background to what they were actually doing. So they were accepting it as a safe reference, and in that way also reinforcing its status. This is how things go. This is what is the case. That's still being done, I think. I haven't done this systematic work, but the sort of things that I pick up. I think, but Mike might want to correct me, in science policy, the reference to mode 2 was quite limited. It depends a little bit where you look and when. So around 2000 in South Africa, it was a hot topic, also for science policy. And people were asked to write about it and to draw out implications and so on. And then it passed by, and then South Africa went into national systems of innovation. And that became the hot topic. I would say here that it actually is linked to the fact that there was no immediate decision challenge, as there had been for big science. There was sort of decisions at a lower level in the system, where it was not necessarily the big science policy making, but it was how institutions would interact, how individual scientists, researchers would interact, what sort of things they would be doing, which was to some extent left to them, rather than becoming part of science policy decision making. As I said, it was in a number of ways a timely diagnosis, but was one of many. So I just list a few of them, including one that I like, strategic science. And what I wanted, this listing is not just to say there are others, but also that all of them are naming the situation. These are all attempts of analysts to come to terms with ongoing changes, maybe even transformations, as the mode 1 to mode 2. And there is a tendency to be dichotomous, to have dichotomous history in these various texts that I refer to here. And then you get the naming, so that the things can travel, and also drawing out of implications. Some do that more than others. So if it is a fashion, it is a bit more general than just mode 1 to mode 2, although that was for a time the key thing about these diagnoses. And in a sense, what also happens is that analysts are vying for attention of policymakers, of other publics. So that's another dynamic which is involved in maintaining the fashion. My third case is later, and perhaps of a different kind. It doesn't really start with analysts. It comes from the policy-making world. It's a buzzword at the moment, European Union in particular. There was the Lund Declaration, which introduced it almost formally with a number of examples. And at the moment you see a core list of the ones I've seen, often 6 grand challenges. Energy, of course, climate change, aging society, and there is some variation, but there is also this convergence. And it's not just European Union. You see similar words and policy talk and some action, like in the United States under the Obama administration, the green energy stuff, for example. And actually it has a bit of a prehistory. UK Research Council were using the term, but they were using it at a slightly lower level. So they had these cross-cutting themes, and this was to a large extent, I think, but people might want to correct me, a response to the 2007 government spending review. And they had themes like energy and aging, and that was important for them to show that they were doing important things with the money that they were getting from the public purse. And then they defined the actual work on these themes in terms of a list of grand challenges. So it was a lower level of the situation. And now it's really up there. What they called themes are now called grand challenges in the European Union. You get the question how to address such grand challenges. There's many actors involved, including much more interest in public-private combinations. There are open-ended goals. Aging society can still be about lots of different things. I'm not going to sort of go into the details, but you can think of them for yourself. And then I've sometimes argued that there is also another challenge, which is about the institutions and arrangements of the science and technology and innovation systems. One thing I mention here is the example of charitable foundations. You know all the Wellcome Foundation, Wellcome Trust, and then Wellcome Foundation, I think. Well, again, I haven't checked the actual wording. At the moment, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is very important, particularly in the developing world, but not only there. But you have earlier examples like the Rockefeller Foundation, which in a sense put molecular biology on the map in the 1930s and 1940s. We did scenarios about grand challenges and about a number of other things in a European project, European Union project. And we actually showed that with addressing grand challenges and the public-private interactions and all the tensions that will be there, it would be very interesting if charitable foundations like Bill and Melinda Gates would be willing to step into the negotiations and actions and become the manager of a grand challenge program. And we can develop that a little bit, but there are a number of reasons why this is not only an interesting thought, but we might actually move in that direction. So that would be a way of addressing grand challenge. It would also imply that there will be these residues. Even if the grand challenge in general and the particular grand challenge that's being worked on, if they disappear into the limbo, then still there will be these arrangements, there will be these experiences. And actually, if you look at some of the analysis that people did, including Jacob Edler, about how the framework programs, particularly in the early 1980s, emerged, created spaces which were filled with new arrangements, then you see that similar things might happen with the grand challenges, somewhat independent of the title of the term. One sort of speculation from my side is that a driver for coming up with these grand challenges at that high level is that science policy makers need new opportunities for policy making. That's their business, that's their job, that's their justification for being there at all. And economic valorization, which was very high on the agenda in the 1980s and 1990s, is more or less in place. People do it, know how to do it, there are arrangements and stuff. People also know about the difficulties and the problems. So it's this articulation and investment stuff that I added to Down's 5 stages. So now they don't have much to do there. So they go for these public good challenges. And that's then a new opportunity for them to be busy in policy making. And as I said again and again, there will be residues even if the fashionable term is disappearing. The 4th case, as Mick was saying, I'm working on that myself at the moment. So I could again tell you a lot more than I will do now. You see already that I've added the acronym RRI, and that's one thing that you see happening in Brussels and in the member states of the Commission, of the Union. It's a fashionable discourse, and people recognize it for that, and they see there's a big problem of what to actually do. And there is this battle about definitions and battle about which direction to go. And it definitely has become an acronym, so you can wave the RRI flag and you'll get people to workshops and discussions and so on. It's now explicitly said and emphasized that RRI will be pervasive in the Horizon 2020 framework program, which has just started. Being pervasive means that it will be everywhere. And so the risk is that it will be nowhere, but how that will then actually function is a second we will see. After internal negotiations, and I don't know the details, they decided to have a sort of more official program, which was the sequel to Science in Society program, with the awful acronym SWAFS. It's the sound that some dogs might make, but anyway, it stands for Science with and for Society. And I've really struggled to remember that what the acronym means. A root of this movement, if you look at it over the last, 15 years or so, is the call, which was very explicit in the area of nanotechnology, the call for responsible development. And I could give you quotes and stuff. And what you also see is not just the European Commission and some of the member states. It's actually also funding agencies, research consortia, research institutes, who refer to RRI or to the Code of Conduct for Nanotechnology. And in the Netherlands, the the sequel to the earlier consortium for R&D in nanotechnology now says in the new description of what they're going to do, they will all adhere to the code of conduct for responsible development of nanotechnology. So somewhat independent from the sort of nudging that the European Commission is doing, you see other actions as well. And as I said in the small print, it could be impression management. If we do this, then society will not interfere with our investments in nanotechnology R&D. But even if it is impression management, it can have implications. And I've got a wonderful example of what, to my mind, has started as impression management, which is this poster. And while you try to read it, it's called Responsible Research in Action here. I consider every aspect of my research, including what happens with it outside of the lab. And there you see the lady smiling and the field of grain, which somehow profits from nanotechnology, clearly. And for more information, you can visit the website. This is part of the National Nanotechnology Initiative in the United States, where a number of the labs are forced, between quotes, to do something about responsible research and innovation. And then nothing much may happen. The posters might be replaced by other posters in another year or two, but they might be taken up on it. And as has happened with biotechnology sometimes, that outsider and particular critical groups would take up the research institutes and research agencies on their impression management. This is actually part of what we have called the multi-level processes at different levels. So we no need to go into the details, but you can see that you have the macro level with societal discourse and with policies like the one from the European Commission, the EU Code of Conduct, which I referred to already. At the meso level, very important, you have the funding agencies, you have branch organizations, which come up with code of conduct sometimes. You have consortia. I could go into the details to show that this is actually supported empirically. And at the micro level, you have the scientists in the lab who will want to show that what they're doing is relevant and good in all senses of the word. You have industrialists and firms who can fall back on sometimes the tradition of corporate social responsibility and often now try to be more transparent but have difficulty in doing so. So all these things are happening together. And that's why I call them multi-level processes and the interaction between these levels. Actually, if you look at what's happening, you can see that it's not just anything goes. Certain paths become visible. Oh, in nanotechnology, definitely. And by extrapolation, RRI in general. And one thing is that a number of actors actually fall back on a neoliberal principle, what is good to do no harm, and then you're free to continue with what you're doing. And again, we could go into that discussion because there are also other kinds of ethical, political principles. There is a strong emphasis in the RRI discussion about emerging technologies, as if old technologies have no problems. And what I intimated already, new roles and new routines might emerge. And then you get the residue stuff again. These will persist after the fashion to refer to responsible research and innovation has run its course. The driver here, one important driver, which links up to my impression management point, is that the license to operate, which can be very formal in terms of regulation, becomes a social license to operate. It's not necessarily limited to what regulatory offices are saying and decreeing. And that's happening because there are credibility pressures in society, of society, on science and technology. And something has to be done. And then responsible research and innovation is a way to extend the social license to operate. You can actually imagine that this is not a particular fashion, it's actually part of a larger change in handling new technologies. Go through this briefly. There are precursors, the Human Genome Project with its ethical, legal and social issues or impacts component. The Responsible Care Program in the chemical industry, which has interesting achievements, and it's a bottom-up thing, with the credibility pressures important. Now synthetic biology, geoengineering, already at a very early stage say we have to be transparent, we have to think about the impacts, we have to interact with publics, and so on and so forth. The question is, will it continue, and what form will it take? And if you look at what's happening, you can see reductions of the broad message that you can link up with responsible research and innovation. There's this focus on upstream, which is related to trying to create acceptance at an early stage for newly emerging technologies. There's a focus on risk issues, which are much more tractable, it seems, if you just look at it superficially, than societal and ethical issues. It's sometimes phrased as hard impacts versus soft impacts, which is an interesting, very loaded distinction. And this is one of my interests, to actually look at narratives of praise and blame. Jerry Ravetz, way back, said, had this wonderful, how do you call it? Saying, writing, scientists or science takes credit for penicillin, but society takes the blame for the bomb. And that's distribution of praise and blame is a very important part of responsibility, and distribution of responsibility, and how things are taken up or not. So this is a possibility. I think I'm now winding up. Yeah. But before I show you what I've put down here as items for further thought, I'd like to say, sort of looking back, that although these cases were chosen because I was intrigued or had lots of things to do with them in my own work, I do think they offer an interesting cross-section in terms of the topic of fashions in science policy. What they don't do yet very much is to really go into mechanisms and drivers and outcomes. So you could actually think of a theory of fashions in science policy, where I could go back to some of the things I said at the very beginning. And perhaps, I mean, there are these models, simulation models, about how things can multiply, build on themselves, and maybe then also collapse. And I haven't gone into that, but that would be one direction to go. My present conclusions or ideas about further work and thinking. One is the difference between the four cases. So the big science case and the mode 2 case, they start with a diagnosis of ongoing transformations. While grand challenges and responsible research and innovation do not do much observation. They're actually much more proactive. They want desirable transformation, and they're going to invest in making that happen. And so that's a difference. And you could actually ask, and that's the final sentence here, is this itself a secular change? That science policy is now, not perhaps able, but definitely willing to be proactive. So this is a desirable transformation. And it goes further than the sort of 1950s rhetorics about a world without hunger, which was a grand challenge, you could say, but then it was rhetorics more than, and not much more than justification of particular projects, and that continues as well. Here, you could actually perhaps see that science policy is not only willing to be much more concrete, not just have the rhetorics, but also to talk about desirable transformations of society. And that is, I think, new, because science policy for a long time was sort of focusing on its own reserve. We are working with science and technology, that's it. And other things about society and social orders were sort of these rhetorics on a very high level. And here, you could say with the aging society, they're actually trying to have a world with, as the UK has phrased it, lifelong health and well-being. And so they're actually broadening out from science policy to general societal considerations and perhaps policies. My recurrent point was fashions are there for a reason. You can inquire in drivers and how they came about. They have effects. These effects are not linear, so the avowed goals of the fashion or the thrust of the fashion might not in a linear way lead to outcomes that are related to that. There might be very different outcomes, and that's because of these multi-level processes. And then my final question, maybe what we see as STI policy and as governance of STI arrangements could be the accumulation of all these residues of earlier fashions. And that's not the whole story. There's more to STI policy than that. But since it will be there, it will be a part, and sometimes an important part of what we have, it does imply that every now and then you should actually step back and have a critical look at what has accumulated and how it's still functioning. And that is a research program in its own right, which I might not actually start to do, who knows, but is definitely something that should also be on the agenda. Thank you.